First of all, I just want to take a few minutes to say something about Malintzin Society. We can say more about this tomorrow, but it's a thrill to be working with Malintzin, to be here to present for and with Malintzin. This is an inaugural event, and the energy this weekend has been spectacular. We've been privileged with so many different perspectives for how to entertain and to think about and to enter the other. I hope that you have energy for one more. This perspective will be from the entrance of ecology into the other. So a little bit on nature. Now, the word nature is one of the most complex words in the language, yet its complexity is concealed by how easily and regularly we use the term. It's at once both very familiar and extremely elusive. So my intention is not to go into the politics of nature, but rather to explore an ecological and psychological concept of other as experienced in our inner life. So to experience the other internally as psyche, one might also experience this phenomenon externally as nature. One way to understand this is to take the perspective that psyche is nature, or nature is psyche. How we tend to see ourselves, in part, is how we tend to see others in the world. When we reject the other within, we project it out there onto others, onto flora, onto fauna, onto the planet. So eco-psychologically, this phenomenon could be expressed as a lack of diversity. And that's what I want to get into a little bit this afternoon, the minutiae of how we work with this. In a very simple way, actually. The question I want to work with tonight is, how might we envision seeing or experiencing the other within in a different, if not new way? First, I want to explore a little bit about ecological diversity, so that we might mine a few images that will help us enter psyche ecologically, and maybe uncover or recover some of our psychological variety. Ecologically, nature is a myriad web of organized, interdependent, complex interactions and interconnections of integrated relations. In other words, multiple ecosystems within ecosystems. Psychologically, psyche, our inner life, is also a myriad web of organized, interdependent, complex interactions and interconnection of interrelated relations. In other words, multifaceted systems, multiphasic systems, and ever so complex as well. So, following Carl Jung and James Hillman, nature or psyche cannot really be defined. We can only state them as to what we understand them to be or how we experience them in our lives. For Jung, psyche is nature. It contains everything, and so also contains the unknown. Jung states, it is beyond truth and error, independent of the interference of consciousness, and therefore completely at odds with the intentions and attitudes of the ego. This was Jung's notion of the collective unconscious. I know that you know all this, but hear me here. In essence, then, we too are nature. Psyche too is an ecosystem within the environment of the collective unconscious. James Hillman distills out the difference between psyche, between nature and environment, where erroneously we've equated the two. And there's a little difference there. Environment, meaning the turning around of things, that which is close by or immediate, is wilderness as much as city. Hillman calls for a more sophisticated notion of environment, one that goes beyond simply identifying with nature. His emphasis is on environment as a co-presencing of the visible and the invisible, the known and the unknown. However, he states, what we go to nature for is the invisible. The other resides within these invisible realms, is invisible, and yet the tension, the unrest, the ambiguity, the hostility, the violence that is brought about by the other is very visible. Ecologically, the most invisible places within an ecosystem are where the most diversity resides. Diversity holds identity for an ecological or a psychological system. Loss of diversity results in suffering, death, extinction, loss of identity. The themes of identity, however, are further complicated by our disconnection from the wider ecosystem, the wider world, and that's been talked about this weekend enough already, so I won't go into it. It's been mentioned very beautifully in many different ways. And I think we know that already. Years ago when ecopsychology first came out, the whole banner was we were separated from the natural world, we're disconnected from the natural world. Well, we know that now, so what do we do about that? So for people like Jung and Hellman and before them, and of course many of you in this room, Darwin and Freud and those who follow their thinking, no living creature can escape suffering. To be alive, they say, let alone conscious, is to be subject to unavoidable stresses, or in ecopsychology we would call them disturbances, conflict, pain, loss. Darwin's view to be in nature is to be in a war dominated by scarcity of resources and potential extinction. Conflict, anguish, distress are integral to life. However, Darwin and E.O. Wilson and other current naturalists in biology see the diversity as the key to life's flourishing. Ecopsychology, from a depth perspective, would see diversity as the key to the flourishing of the psyche. And don't let that fool you. It's not life is a bed of roses or a bowl of cherries and everything's going to be cool if we're in nature. It's actually the opposite of that, and of course that's where I'm going to go. So all of these writers, these naturalists of the soul, place psyche in the body. Darwin used different terminology, but he too described life as synonymous with the body. And therefore, we're amazingly adaptive creatures. We're amazingly resilient, but also extremely vulnerable. And of course, we're always shadowed by death. Extinction was mainly due to loss of diversity in our ecology. What does that mean for our psychology? The individual, Freud wrote months before he died, perishes from his internal conflicts. The species perishes in its struggle with the external world to which it no longer is adapted. Depth psychology would advocate that these deaths, in a sense, are needed. The deaths of old narratives, the deaths of old individual and cultural myths, the old belief systems need to die before new life, new ideas can spring forth. It's a way for psyche to clear out in a way of thinking of that, if you want an image. Clearing out to some degree so that more diverse thinking, more diverse ideas, more diverse perspectives can come in. The image of a forest just came into my mind, deforesting, and that could be argued, how could that be, diversity? But hopefully I'll address that as we go along here, because that is an image that pops up with this. So for these naturalists, these psychologists, it was death before life. It was either adapt or die. And adaptation involves suffering and loss. We suffer the loss of a story, we suffer the loss of a dream, we suffer the loss of a cultural mythology. So adaptation, though, also requires an ecosystem to create and enhance and expand its diversity. Ecologically, and hear me metaphorically here, please, ecologically, The diversity of an ecosystem is dependent on the physical characteristics of the environment. The diversity of a species present and the interactions that the species have with each other within that environment. So that makes the environment very complex. There's a lot of complexity there. So if there's more complexity, there's more diversity. If there's less complexity, there's less diversity. So for our psychology, the more complex we are, potentially there's a lot of diversity there. If there's not much diversity, there's not much complexity. However, some ecosystems, such as submarine black smokers or thermal vents or hot springs, that do not appear to be physically complex, and they're not especially rich in diverse populations of species, are considered to be functionally complex. And this is because they include species that have remarkable biochemical specializations for surviving in a very harsh environment. They obtain their energy from inorganic chemical sources, and these organisms are called extremophiles. They exist in the harshest environments that we know of in the natural world. Extremophiles. A great image for otherness. So, for Darwin to develop his theory of evolution, he of course studied thousands of ecological populations and communities of species. Ecologically and socially, a population is a group of individuals in a single species that live in a particular area and interact with each other. A community is an association of these interacting populations. Now, the science of populations ecologically is very intricate, it's huge. It looks at groupings of organisms and how they live in an environment, keeping Hillman's notion of the invisibles in the environment in the forefront here. So how these organisms live together in an environment. How do they cope with all the possibilities within that ecosystem? How do they deal with or cultivate diversity or lack of diversity within that ecosystem? Without diversity, populations cease to exist. So to study a population, there's a few things that we do ecologically. We study the life history, how individual species grow and at what rate they mature. We look at population distribution, which can be limited by habitat suitability, historical factors, dispersal, good places to live or bad places affect the individual of the species. A desert species is not likely to live in the Arctic nor survive there. Someone in Southeast LA is probably not going to necessarily thrive in downtown Santa Barbara, even though you might think that they would. I probably would not survive too long in a desert environment myself. So it's interesting to think about these places as to where we would fit ourselves in. We also look at abundance, population growth and regulation, and the dynamics of the population. How one individual can change the whole species. Looking at the dynamics of a population is essentially looking at our interior makeup. When we study critters in the natural world and we look at all these things ecologically, we can take that and look at it psychologically too, as it turns in and looking at our interior life. What's going on inside us? What's going on inside our particular ecosystem? There's 4 processes that change a population. Birth, death, immigration, coming in, or what we have called this weekend urbanization also, and immigration, going out or evacuation. These movements that occur in nature, that occur naturally in the wild, are very complex socio-political issues for us humans, right? So, to look at this ecopsychologically, the study of an ecosystem population is looking at our interior life, our human psychological life. We too examine our life history. We look at our family mythologies, our family narratives, the personal story that drives our behaviors, where we have lived and why in that particular place. What about the landscape drew us there? What about the landscape that expelled us potentially?